Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Andreas Jungherr. He's an assistant professor for social science data collection and analysis at the University of Constance, and he's got a new book out entitled Retooling Politics: How Digital Media Are Shaping Democracy. And it's published by Cambridge University Press just last month in June 2020, and co-authored with Gonzalo Rivero from Westat in the United States and Daniel Gayo-Avello from the University of Oviedo in Spain. And I really enjoyed this book. Some of you maybe have seen me tweeting about it. I found it so refreshing that there is a resource that covers such a comprehensive range of actors that digital media affects, but also different processes such as information and communication flows that really just cuts through the hype of, marketer speak and journalistic and academic gloom and doom around these issues. And it's really just an account that's backed up by science and what we currently know at this stage. And so as I was reading it, I was just nodding my head in agreement and also thinking this is how we should be discussing the main issues of digital media and politics. It's a very realist account. It slices through the hype. I think it's a great introductory book for academics to use in their courses, but also really for tech journalists and people working in platforms. I know some of you listen to the podcast. Read this book and you'll be caught up on what you need to know in terms of what science says, but more importantly, how to be thinking about these topics. And in this episode, we'll be diving into some of the main themes behind the book, but because each chapter is almost its own subfield of political communication, it's too much to pack into one episode. But I think the takeaway is to listen to how the arguments are made or how the topics are being approached critically and backed up by what we know. And I agree with Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen from the University of Oxford, his review of the book, which says, this book will help combat the catchy but simplistic narratives advanced by digital cheerleaders and doom mongers and contribute to more realistic and evidence-based alternatives. And who doesn't love that? So there'll be a link to the book in the show notes if you want to find out more about it. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Andreas Jungherr. Again, he's an assistant professor for social science data collection and analysis at the University of Constance. Dr. Jungherr, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, congrats on the book. As I mentioned in the introduction, I really like how it reins in some of the hype around digital media and politics by presenting a much more sober account backed up by decades of political science and communication research. So I'd like to first ask about the timing of the book. Why write it now? And do you think that social science has reached a point where we can confidently contextualize how digital media shapes democracy?
Yeah, first of all, I'm very happy that the book reads well and seems to work. The current moment is quite interesting because I'm not so sure that we have all the answers yet that we need. So I'm not so sure that political science is necessarily ready to provide all the answers. But I believe that we're currently seeing a lot of interest that is going beyond the usual suspects that is starting to focus on digital media and politics. So our goal with the book was basically to provide everybody who right now starts out thinking about this topic kind of a large-scale picture of actually saying, okay, what are potential debates? What are some of the findings? And also kind of trying to get away from the, let's say, enthusiasm or hysteria of the current moment and actually say, look, there is something structural going on. We have some structural shifts that are going on, and traditionally political science is very good at identifying those, thinking structurally about problems. And these perspectives might help us contextualize to identify the current and also the future effects of digital media and politics. So currently, it's not so much about to provide a final answer to these issues, but more to provide an entry point to different fields that start to develop interest in this issue, but might have difficulties in identifying kind of angles on how to approach the topic.
Right, because the book starts out, mentioning the Brexit referendum and the Trump election, and we'll get into that a bit later on. And so I'm wondering, is that just kind of a attention grabber for the start of the book, or was that more of a catalyst to get into these issues, or is perhaps some of the debate around these events leading to writing the book?
I think, the events that you mentioned are kind of somewhat subsequent to the original conception of the book. So the original idea of the book comes from Daniel Gallo Avello, one of my co-authors here, who's a computer scientist, and he's very, very interested in the effects of digital media and politics. And he was starting kind of approaching these issues and trying to think through how to provide an entry point for interested computer scientists in thinking about these issues and thinking about these issues maybe slightly more deeply than kind of, well, hitting up Google Scholar and look at the top 5 results for politics and digital media. And then we started talking about this, and then these events happened. And I think you're absolutely right to talk about these events as catalysts. I think they're not so much catalysts for us thinking about the book, but they're definitely catalysts for different fields and for definitely a broadening of interest in the effects of digital media and politics. So we felt it's absolutely right to start with those events, because these are kind of the focus points of public imagination of digital media and politics, and probably more imagination than actually fact. And that is something that we want to try to unearth with the book.
Right. And we'll get into that a bit more as we move along. But as the title of the book implies, you're examining how digital media can lead to a retooling of politics for a wide range of actors, including news publishers, political campaigns, advocacy organizations, and of course, citizens. And for each of these actors, you argue that this retooling is better characterized as an adaptation to achieve their needs rather than a fundamental transformation of politics as such. So can you outline those 2 key concepts in the book for us? The retooling of politics within a needs-oriented perspective.
Yeah, I'm happy to. The idea of kind of retooling kind of emerged once we started discussing different uses of digital media and politics. And originally, we started out with a very much stronger focus on different actors and their uses of digital media. But then kind of discussing these different uses, we then kind of found it doesn't really matter if you're talking about politicians. It doesn't really matter if you're talking about unions or administrations. All of these face a specific set of challenges that they have in their role in politics, and they tend to use digital media in similar ways to pursue them. So we started out with a much more traditional way of thinking about this issue, and then kind of stepping slightly away from these different cases and taking kind of a 6,000-foot look on the issue. We suddenly saw that there were commonalities between these different fields that often do not really talk to each other all that much. And for us, the image that captured that probably best was the idea of thinking about a political actor in pursuit of a goal, having a specific need to reach that goal, and using technology, and in our case, digital media, to pursue that slightly better. So digital media presents these actors with new tools, basically retooling those actors in pursuit of those needs.
Right. And would you say that those needs are relatively stable over time? I think you argue at some point in the book about conceptualizing democracy from an institutional perspective, where these actors work within very slow-moving institutions and therefore their needs actually don't change so much.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, we're always talking more or less about the same thing. So we're talking about actors who fight for attention. We're talking about actors who fight for legitimacy in distributing resources or make decisions on how resources should be distributed. And those are very fundamental and very basic collective action or collective coordination problems. And so we think, for example, the need to reach people. The need to reach people was already there if you're thinking about the democracy in Athens and how to reach those people who matter for political decisions. Of course, who these people who matter are has shifted over time, and the technology in reaching those people has shifted over time. But what we're talking here is a basic need that arises when you're talking about collective coordination and collective action problems.
Going back to Athens, I love that. But you argue in the book that much of this retooling happens through mundane changes in political communication rather than a series of explosive innovations. And I think, by nature, we're kind of wired to focus on these particularly exceptional examples. But you write in the book that the everyday grind of politics is where the impact of digital media can be seen most clearly. So can you unpack that argument for us? Why focus on the mundane aspects of digital media rather than exceptional practices?
I think, that is an idea that we basically lifted from an article, an argument that Rasmus Kleis Nielsen made quite a few years back already. when he talked about everybody's focusing on the Obama campaign and how Obama is using social media, but that might not actually be the reality of most campaigns that we're actually facing. And there has been very, very nice research done on that also by Jesse Baldwin-Philippi, who's looking at local races in the US and their use of digital media. And she also shows that the uses of digital media that is emerging there are very much different from those that we see in these tentpole campaigns or these stories that we then read about in the Atlantic or in the New York Times about how digital media is shifting the game of campaigning. So while it's absolutely necessary and I think absolutely crucial for the field to develop a deep understanding of these kind of exceptional cases or these exceptional moments of digital media use, it's also very much important to understand that those are exceptions. So they can show some of the potential under some circumstances quite clearly, and they capture our imagination, they capture our attention. So they are really important to understand and to get them right. But then also that most campaigns around the world or most political actors around the world neither have the resources or are in contexts that are applicable or comparable to these exceptional moments. And we also have to understand how digital media is lived or is used in these cases, because that will basically be the experience of digital media in politics that the predominant majority of actors will have.
Right. And I mean, the book goes into so many different examples and actors, and it covers so much ground. I think if I asked you about every chapter or every part of the book, we'd be here all day. So instead, in kind of following up on your last answer, I thought we'd play a little game that I'm tentatively calling Mythbusters, because I think a few of these narratives have reached mythical status in, especially in public debate. So pretend I'm a tech journalist and I haven't read any of the academic literature. And I'm going to ask you a few questions. And the first topic I'd like to discuss is echo chambers and filter bubbles. So, since people tend to read political news they agree with, and since platform algorithms serve users what they like, social media will lead to the formation of echo chambers and filter bubbles where citizens can only see views that confirm their opinions. And surely this has contributed to high levels of polarization, right?
Well, I mean, that is definitely one of the narratives that is out there. So I think, I mean, the interesting thing here to unpack is currently we are in the debate, I think, in a really bad equilibrium between people who are saying, look, there are echo chambers and they lead to polarizations, and the other people who are saying, look, we don't find any echo chambers, we're looking in our data. And that leads to a rather problematic, is it there or is it not there, debate, or kind of a gotcha debate also. But it might actually be kind of just a focus on one aspect. I mean, these two sides in the debate are not necessarily focusing on the same evidence or the same phenomena. So if you're looking at some of the evidence that is there for echo chambers, you have the idea that people on digital media are basically communicating with like-minded people, therefore are continuously seeing information that is reinforcing that position, and over time that will lead kind of society to move apart. This is a very intuitive image and very intuitively phrased by the proponents. And it's absolutely true that if you're looking at specific digital services, you will find people who are moving in largely homogeneous political environments. So you will definitely find Facebook groups where political supporters meet and exchange views. You definitely find subreddits where politically homogeneous people are interacting. If you're only looking at those groups, or if you're only looking at specific hashtags or the audience of Breitbart News or subreddits, then you will find echo chambers. But then the thing is, so identifying that and talking about that and talking about the potential effect that these homogeneous communication environments might have on people is absolutely legitimate and absolutely a valuable way to spend your time. But then doing the next step and saying this will then automatically lead for society to move apart because people are only interacting in these spaces, this then needs different kind of evidence. Because as it turns out, even people who read Breitbart are not only reading Breitbart, they're also reading other news outlets, they're also watching television, and they're also at work communicating with people who are not necessarily sharing their opinions. So this automatic link between being active in some homogeneous political communication spaces and political polarization as such, that is something that I would believe the evidence does not yet show. And if you're looking at some of the empirical research out there on this, there's a recent paper by Andy Guess on this. And there's great work done by Sandra Gonzalez-Bayon on overlapping audiences. Again, great work by the Reuters Institute for Journalism. So what you see once you shift away from that more microscopic view on specific services, on specific behaviors, and take more kind of, if you like, ecological perspective to see how people are embedded in other media uses or also in social uses, you then see that these homogeneous spaces are maybe not as prevalent as the narrative of echo chambers in digital media might have us believe. And so that the link to political polarization might not be as automatic as we sometimes take away in reading editorials.
Definitely. And at the expense of blowing up my game here, I'm going to step out of it for a second and ask you a question that just popped up in my head, which is about, the echo chamber kind of debate is essentially about cognitive bias to an extent, right? Following the news and like-minded people that you kind of agree with. Do you think there's a sense of that also with scholars studying these things where, as you said, the link between echo chambers and polarization isn't automatic, but you can kind of cobble together different pieces of the literature to argue one way or the other. So do you think there's kind of an echo chamber effect of people believing in echo chambers or not?
Yeah, I think.
I know that's kind of a meta level question.
Yeah, but I mean, there then the discussion becomes really interesting because then it moves away a little bit from this very empiricistic way of looking at the thing. So I found a homogeneous communication space online, so there will be polarization. So I show you an isolated piece of evidence, and then I tell you a story about that, why this is relevant. And I would argue that some of the literature that is out there is very, very good on the empirical aspect, very imaginative of looking at these communication spaces, but then is rather heroic in the way of projecting this evidence with regard to larger social consequences. And there, I think what you're pointing out is absolutely true. That we see the field kind of. It nearly looks like, to me, it looks like kind of a generational divide or so. So you have the silverbacks of the field, so you have the Karsansteins of the world who believed strongly in the echo chamber and basically wrote the same book 3 times about the topic. So he believes on that. Then then you have a younger generation who is kind of more empirically trained, also a little bit more skeptic, and also more optimistic with regard to the effects of of digital media. And they are then kind of focusing on disproving this very critical narrative of the effects of digital media and politics. And that generation then again is challenged by younger scholars coming up right now who are doing the PhD or kind of entering the postdoc levels, who are then challenging this group again, because I mean their experiences of digital media have been again more negative. So if you're looking at some of the effects of the YouTube algorithms or some of the stories connected with that, all of that is part of that fresher generation of that experience of the internet when digital media became a less nice or supportive place and much more contested. And I would believe that this group is then more ready again to believe in the effects of echo chambers and then are looking more strongly for evidence on this.
Very interesting, this generational perspective. Also, I mean, these different generations have interacted with these technologies at various levels of their inception, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So going back into the game, narrative 2, Cambridge Analytica. Through dubious means, or the claim is, through dubious means, Cambridge Analytica acquired Facebook data and targeted users with persuasive messages based on their personality types. Surely this psychological warfare tool explains both the Brexit referendum and Donald Trump's victory, right?
Well, again, totally right with regard to the narrative. And then again, I think this is something that one has to, critically interrogate at different places of that narrative. So for one, I think it's very important to keep in mind that, I mean, why are we talking about Cambridge Analytica and why are we talking about these psychometric targeting methods? We are talking about that first on the basis of Cambridge Analytica's own marketing material and their claims that they're raising with regard to the powers that they have in persuading people. And we're talking also about that because a series of whistleblowers have come forward and again talked about the nefarious uses of social media data. But if you're looking at that, both of these groups are not necessarily disinterested actors. I mean, both of these groups have a very, very strong interest in presenting us with narratives that show how powerful these tools are, how powerful these services are, and how skillful they are in using those. So the evidence that we're having presented to us in that regard is maybe not the most, let's say, stable. So what happens if we look for other clues on whether this might be true? And if you're looking actually at media coverage of Cambridge Analytica going back to the time before Trump, we actually see that the media coverage is very, very critical about the company and very, very critical about the claims that the company raises, even with regard to the services that they're providing for the campaigns they're working for. So what I would argue that if we're looking at that journalistic coverage, there's at least a question to be asked whether these services were actually provided to the degree that has been suggested in the media coverage and the presentational material. That's the first question that is there, where these services actually provided. And then the second question is, even if these services would have been provided, how susceptible are we to psychological manipulation on Facebook? And again, I would be probably a little bit more skeptical than some of my colleagues in this arena when it's about the actual kind of benefit that you're getting from having a supposedly targeted message targeted to your personality profile. It's a benefit that this is getting from kind of a well-designed general communicative intervention. And given that the general effect of these interventions is already quite small, then I'm not necessarily convinced that the slight tweaking of that messages to a psychological profile that the communicative actor cannot really know, but is only guessing at, is then really kind of producing such a massive benefit or added benefit from a normal campaign. So I would argue, if you're looking at the evidence that is there, at its least kind of a legitimate question to be asked whether these services were provided at all at the scale suggested. And then secondly, if the effect that is attributed to them really, really matters with regard to shifting people's opinions in high profile and very, very contested elections.
Right. I really like how you deal with that in the book, especially around this term psychological warfare tool, which is you're not necessarily being critical of the reporting, the original kind of Guardian reporting that broke the story, but you're more saying, this is what they said. There wasn't, when we look at the literature, it doesn't quite necessarily give grounds for these claims that were made in much of the media reporting. I just like how you kind of walk that line in the book.
Yeah, I think, that is something that we're trying. And sometimes in the book, I think we're more successful than in other places in towing that line. But I think, it's very important in the current state to be humble with regard to what we actually know and what we basically do not know at this current point. And I would argue that we know very, very little about actual users, about the effects of actual users, and therefore that we basically should learn to ask more interesting or more substantive questions of then saying, look, it's totally legitimate to talk about Cambridge Analytica and their potential effects on electoral campaigns. But we should be very, very careful in attributing these actors so much power without necessarily having kind of reliable evidence on this, because that potentially means that we create narratives that lead us to distrust elections, that lead us to distrust the use of digital media in elections overall, or that lead us to distrust the legitimacy of these elections. And we do all this not necessarily based on really convincing and coherent evidence. We do so based on the narratives of interested actors in this whole discussion. So that is something that we try to do with the book to point out, okay, that is what we know, or there are points of doubt, and how can we move to a point where we have more reliable evidence on this, and where we then can also kind of move away from these more either deeply enthusiastic or deeply skeptical readings of digital media and politics.
Right, which fits exactly with the sort of theoretical concepts of the book, right? That we have to remember that pretty much all of these actors, whether it's politicians or the media, they have certain needs that they're using digital media to fulfill.
And there's also an interesting element there if we're talking about the uses of Facebook or the uses of targeted messages in campaigns, because we have spent, if you're thinking back to the early 2000s or to the late 1990s, we always talked about that problem of people not being interested in politics, people tuning out of politics, not being reachable anymore by political actors or by the media. And we're basically losing a large part of the population that is moving away from politics. And now digital media potentially provides you with an opportunity as a political actor to then say, okay, I know that there is an audience out there for my more kind of politically sophisticated arguments or for my deeper policy proposals, But then there's also a larger audience out there that I first have to interested in the current campaign, or that I have to first kind of entice to get back to politics. And those people remained invisible to me in the 1990s or in the 2000s. But digital media provides you with a lot of opportunities of actually reaching these people through targeted messages and getting into touch with them. And that is an opportunity that can have many, many beneficial consequences for politics and engaging people and giving these narratives that we're currently having about manipulation, Cambridge Analytica, Facebook ads as largely being problematic or manipulative. We're completely neglecting maybe the larger issue or the more important issue. How can I get these people back into politics who are basically saying, look, your tonality is not right for me. I have actually better things to do than argue about symbols with you. I actually have to earn a living. And digital media might actually provide political actors to get back in touch with these people and find ways of communicating with them that brings them back into politics. But with this whole focus on negativity and manipulation, we're basically, losing sight of this very, very important task and this great chance that digital media might provide us.
Definitely. Totally agree. So for my last narrative or myth is election prediction. The polls got it wrong in both Brexit and the 2016 US election. Since so many people are on social media, there was probably an undercurrent of activity that the pollsters missed. This data could probably use to predict elections. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, again, this is an argument that has to be parsed, I think, to get to the point. So I think, the first question is whether the polls got it actually quite wrong in the US election or how off they were, because basically they said it would be a narrow race. And then they said, okay, there would be narrow win one side and the other side won with a narrow win. So I'm not necessarily sure that I see a big kind of failure of electoral prediction there. Maybe there's a failure with regard to the precision that we attribute to polls or electoral predictions, and then get annoyed if they basically call a close race for the wrong candidate, while maybe the predictive task was actually to identify that it will be a close race. So I'm not yet there that I distrust the accuracy of polling all that much. Also, I believe we have a very, very strong field there that is actually working on learning from past failures and become smarter with regard to sampling and with regard to the modeling of potential behavior. So I wouldn't probably be so down on polling. And then at the same time, I probably wouldn't be so up on social media or the potentials there, because it's definitely right that social media provides us with insights into ongoing political debates or topics of great interest at the moment, at least among the group of people who are active in social media and willing to talk about politics and willing to self-identify with specific positions and tasks. And this will then mean that we're looking at highly politically involved, highly political, vocal subgroup of the population who still are very, very many people. So you see a lot of tweets or you see a lot of Facebook activity going up there, but still are, if you're thinking about whole populations, are a very small and very, very specific subset of the population there. So I believe it's totally reasonable and necessary to pay attention to the political discourse that is happening on social media, and that this is very beneficial. But then again, I also believe that there are very, very dangerous pitfalls there in extrapolating from what we're seeing there on the priorities or the opinions of majorities in society.
Absolutely. And that'll draw close to the Mythbusters game. A bit of a silly example, I think, but I think it kind of shows how the book engages with some of these narratives and kind of presents the pros and cons of each one. And kind of following up on that last question, but not dealing with election prediction, but kind of your own views as a researcher. You've done a lot of work empirically with social media data. I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this data, particularly when it comes to studying contemporary elections?
I think, social media data are, I think, an immense treasure trove that is there for researchers. But I think, because you basically get access to things that people are willing to share with their social media audiences, and this is very interesting because that kind of, if you take, for example, a long view, which social media, potentially provides you now with. You can see how either collective interests and attention shift over time, and you can also see how individuals change about stuff that they feel interested in or feel ready to share. So I think Chris Bale has written quite a bit about how social media provide us an opportunity to see culture evolve or cultural shifts that are happening there. And you can do so on a very macro level, and you can do so on the micro level if you're looking at individuals. I do not believe that most of the research is already moving in that direction, because I think we have been sidetracked a little bit, especially in political communication research, by maybe molding these data into something that they are not really. So we have played around with that data to infer stuff that interests us independent of social media. So a typical political scientist would not look at Twitter and look at prominent hashtags and see how specific campaigns or specific slogans might evolve around given campaigns or so, because that might be more kind of a communicative representation of a campaign, and maybe not something that the typical political scientist, and I'm overgeneralizing here, might be interested in. Instead, they might look at social media and say, I have all these data of some people, and I can probably use machine learning to understand how specific utterances connect to polls. So I can do machine learning to the thing, and then I can predict the elections, because that is what is interesting to me. If you're thinking about you're saying specific stuff on Twitter, so you're probably on the political right or the political left, no matter what these terms currently mean. So I can place you on some sort of continuum by a statistical method, and then I can use that as an input to something else. So what do conservative users on Twitter actually share? Or how do they interact with non-conservative users on Twitter? So what is happening there is data that might signify something, namely self-presentation, kind of a willing sharing, kind of an intentional sharing of political voice, gets then kind of mangled into something else that seemingly allows us to talk about stuff that we were interested in before. And I would argue that we're currently at a moment in time when it's actually quite valuable to step back from that and actually say, okay, is there something happening in social media discourse itself that is interesting enough for political scientists to pay attention to, so that we can do away with these kind of exercises in method deployment in kind of making different data points fit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think pointing out the kind of differences across the subfields. I want to focus a bit on data-driven campaigning, because that's obviously a big topic and things that both political scientists and political communication scholars are interested in, and especially digital campaigners, right? There seems to be this obsession with social media data and the targeting opportunities. But you caution in the book that it's not a guarantee that future campaigns will continue to build on the technological success of their predecessors. So I wanted to ask if you could unpack the reasons for why, as you write in the book, successful campaigns may consciously neglect technology in favor of other campaigning tools or rhetorical gestures, and vice versa.
Yeah. So I think, there's always this tendency of thinking about technology as once a specific type of use has been developed, once a specific service has been deployed successfully in some context, this will translate to all other contexts that are out there. And I think, I would argue more caution with that. And if you're looking at the literature that is looking at campaigning, and especially the literature that goes very, very closely to campaigns and is very, very closely looking at how campaigns are using specific technologies or using specific services, you see that there's very little evidence of this transformative uses there. So while it's true that probably every campaign has somebody there who tells you currently that they're using data to select people to talk to, it does not necessarily mean that every campaign actually has access to data. And it also does not mean that if they have access to data, that they're then having kind of structures employed in the campaign that is actually using these data in a way that is shifting decision-making within the campaign or shifting resources that are allocated. So what is definitely true that we're seeing kind of an international narrative, kind of usually starting in the US, where campaigns are talking about the big feature of this one campaign, then you see that kind of narrative travel internationally. You see consultants travel internationally, selling that type of narrative to other campaigns, and we then see that narrative kind of pop up in the electoral coverage of these different campaigns. But we have much fewer information about how these campaigns are then actually using these tools. And I mean, there's very interesting research out there that is looking at the role of international consultants in campaigns, and it speaks about some of the amusement that the local campaigners have when the big hired gun from the US comes flown in and talking about something very specific to the US that is not applicable under local law or cultural or even resource conditions. So what I would, especially with regard to that narrative of the role of data in campaigns, would caution is that just because a campaign is talking about a transformative role about data in its practices does not necessarily mean that they're using data the same way, or that data is actually used in a way that is shifting practices that the campaign has done before. And maybe with regard to your other question, so on the one side we have that kind of that context that a campaign finds itself embedded in. We also have kind of a strategic advantage or kind of a strategic situation there. So if you're thinking of the primary election campaign that the Republicans had in 2015, 2016, there we basically saw that all Republicans were, or most Republicans were following the Obama playbook in creating kind of local offices, spending a lot of money on campaigners, spending a lot of money on technology, building up databases. And all of that at a point where in the primary campaigns where resources are really important to actually stay in the game. And they were all kind of thinking the long game and how to prepare for the actual campaign that comes along, investing a lot in technology, but maybe not in a way that is helping them solve the problem that they were really facing, namely, how can I get invited back to the televised debates? How can I show potential donors that I'm a viable candidate? And how can I keep attention on my campaign? And that was something that then candidate Donald Trump, not sure if the word understand is the right word in this context, but that is something that the candidate and his campaign used. They were saying, look, we're not spending any resources and capacities and brain space on thinking about how to solve these issues. We are focusing on how to get on television. We are focusing on how to capture attention and how to illustrate that we are a viable campaign. So what we're having here is a campaign that strategically positions itself in a different place from all the other competitors, and at that point is more able to spend resources to pursue their goal. So I would argue, well, there's definitely an element there of that it's sensible to study how specific digital media was used in specific campaigns. There's also something to be said if you're in a competition of not necessarily doing what all the other people are doing. So if there's a blueprint out there that everybody else is following, you might actually get a strategic advantage in doing something else and investing in something else. So we might actually see other campaigns that do away with technology and focus on different aspects in the presentation and the running of the campaign.
Yeah, I'm thinking about talking a bit about data and consultants and the use of data and kind of all of this obsession around it, that it kind of gets this idea of return on investment, right? Which is, and I think the question is, what is the return? If the return is more money, like you spend, $1 on Facebook ads and you get, $1.50 in donations, that makes sense. But I think a lot of times the return is focused so much on the social media metrics themselves. And it gets to this point of where we're talking about kind of the weaknesses of some of this data. If the consultants are arguing for more resources so they can get more engagement, we really don't know what meaning that engagement has on the more kind of classic markers of success for a campaign.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, if you're looking at some of the research that is out there, if you're looking at Dave Karp, if you're looking at Daniel Kreis, they have been really, really perceptive in kind of tying this innovation and the development of digital campaigning in the US to the way that, on the one hand, the dependency of campaigns for outside money and also then the opportunity of digital media in effectively hauling this money in and better than other ways. So it makes absolutely sense to have a technical development department. If I know that this makes my donation runs so much more effective, then I know I can spend this much on this development and this department. But for campaigns internationally who are much less dependent on these outside funding sources, then it absolutely makes no sense to invest in that development department, which then also means that the solutions that they depend on are actually much more kind of, let's say, standard solutions that they have to buy from the Americans and deploy in their specific context, because they do not have the money, or it makes no sense for the campaign to spend the money in specializing there and then unearthing that potential benefit that might be there. So it's very, very important also to keep in mind what is the political economy of a given campaign that allows them to spend so much money on the development of specific solutions. And I would argue that for one, there's a money component, and the other component that is really interesting is the list component. So how can I develop a list of names and contact information of people that I can reach out to during the campaign, that I can reach out to with information, that I can reach out to with action requests, and that I can mobilize, because given the whole fragmentation of the media landscape, giving the increasing difficulties of using social media to contact people. So these proprietary, those lists that these organizations own themselves or that they build themselves become much more valuable, because it means that they can get information out to people when it really matters to the campaign and get them to do stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And my last question has to kind of, I guess, puts all of this together. It is something you argue at the end of the book, which is that the debate on digital media tends to move between two extremes. On the one hand, we have the radical transformation of politics on the account of digital media. And then on the other, it's that digital media just helps maintain the status quo. So why do you think that that's how the debate is framed between these two extremes? And what can we do to address that going forward?
I think, it's kind of natural that we find these extremes so prominent in the debate, because if you think back, researchers and activists and political campaigners and journalists in the 1990s and the 2000s had to spend a lot of time arguing with people that what was happening there in digital media and the internet was something of importance, that there was something that had to be taken seriously. So I think it's completely understandable and it's completely reasonable to look at these early accounts and see a focus on these exceptional events where digital media were used by specific actors to reach a goal that they surprisingly managed to fulfill. So these events and these stories are really, really important to capture attention and then to inspire a deeper kind of engagement and a deeper understanding of the underlying phenomenon. But unfortunately, this is not necessarily what happens every time. We're currently in a situation where science and definitely journalism is in a very, very fierce competition for attention, and that is not necessarily a competition that is waged by trying to get to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of a phenomenon. It is more driven by kind of extreme labels that we give to a phenomena to get then to capture attention, label a phenomenon, label an effect, and then move on. And I think that this type of kind of attention economy that is evolved is problematic, because it means that instead of, take for example the discussion about echo chambers and filter bubbles. So this is a discussion where it's not necessarily driven by, currently it's not necessarily driven by understanding deeper under which contextual conditions people move in homogeneous communication spaces, how that then changes their behavior, and what are then specific effects that are connected with that. But it's more driven by a logic of, there's this claim there are filter bubbles or echo chambers, and now I prove there are none. There are people out there who claim there are no filter bubbles, but I show you there is one. So we are in this very unfortunate equilibrium where we have these exaggerated kind of claims that are not used to capture attention and then increase understanding, but that are used as attention grabbers to kind of stage a fight between different sides that are then winning out or losing, giving on the evidence at hand at the current moment. So I would argue there's a natural tendency for this situation to emerge, but it's also something that we as researchers, and we as researchers with the opportunities and the privileges giving to us, should actually try to break out of, and not necessarily play that Twitter game where we disprove arguments that nobody really believes in anyway. But kind of then move to a point where we actually go back to the phenomenon and try to understand it more deeply, or also take the concerns of the other side more seriously in the way we engage with. And there's a lot of amazing research out there that is actually doing that. And for us with the book, there was the opportunity and also challenge that we set us to look for that research that is maybe slightly more nuanced, that is offering a richer picture, and actually shine a spotlight on that research and get people who are then saying, look, this is a debate that I actually feel interested in because my intuition is there's something happening, that gives them then an opportunity to engage with these more richer arguments instead of kind of wasting time with the tabloid version or with the editorial version of that argument that is necessarily more reductionist and more driven by attention grabbing and less by increasing understanding motives.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's what I appreciated about the book. And I think it's very timely, but also very important to step back and kind of, as you said, look from this sort of eagle-eye perspective and really engage with what is the science behind these debates. So Dr. Jungherr, thanks so much for taking the time out and coming on the podcast to share it.
Thank you for having me. I mean, this was the first time that I talked in length about the project, and it was a lot of fun. It was great to see that it resonates.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Andreas Jungherr, Assistant Professor for Social Science Data Collection and Analysis at the University of Constance. The book we've been discussing is called Retooling Politics: How Digital Media Are Shaping Democracy, published by Cambridge University Press, and you can find more about it in the show notes. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Dr. Solomon Messing about the role of data and data science across academia and industry. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.